Hey, brothers and sisters. Um, well, the Lord put on my heart the last few days here a set of verses, and I've talked about this in other videos. A lot of times I have a hard time separating, what am I just personally curious about or reading in the Bible, and maybe what does the Lord want me to look at? And usually the dividing thing is if there's something that the Lord's pointing me to, it sticks with me. And if I don't get into it and if I don't study it, it'll stay with me, the set of verses. And that's kind of what happened the last 2, 3 days here. Probably like 4 or 5 days actually. It's been now. Is I had Isaiah chapter 10, verse 21 to the end in my brain, and first day that sort of those verses were stuck there, and I knew Isaiah 10 was an end times oriented chapter, and so you know my brain had chalked that up, but why verse 21 to the end? 21 didn't mean anything to me, and it stayed with me an entire day. That night, I looked up the verses, I read them, and it talks about the return of the remnant of Jacob to God. And so I thought, yep, okay, that's the end time setting, and that's the return of the Israel to the land before the millennial reign. And I read through the verses, and it just kind of you know, jog my memory again. Yep, it's talking about that. Something really interesting, though, started wearing on me, which is in verse 24 here, as I've said in a bunch of videos, the Antichrist is pictured as the Assyrian. And, I've done some videos where I went and studied out the Assyrian in the Old Testament and several others, uh, Rob Skiba and the gentleman that wrote Red Moon Rising. I'm forgetting his name right now, but I've actually linked to articles talked about their work before, how they're picturing the ancient days Nimrod coming back in the end times Babylon. And Nimrod was the first king of these cities after the flood of the cities in Iraq and stuff, which became Assyria. And so the logic is the reference to the Assyrian in the Old Testament is referring to the end times Antichrist, but it has some sort of link to the return of the original world ruler who was Nimrod. So that's the broad context. Now, starting in Isaiah 10, verse 24, we have this reference to the Assyrian. And as you come down here, it talks about how he's going to um, come through in the day of, it ends up being the day of Armageddon. But it's listing specific cities as we come through here. Now, yeah, I guess we'll talk about this a little bit right now, and then we can don't have to drill into it more later. So I was trying to think, okay, what does the Lord want me to figure out from all this? And so I started plotting the cities, and it didn't mean a whole lot to me. It basically says the Antichrist is coming down through the West Bank, and there's a ravine or a valley in here, and Nob is where he stops, and you can see where his tanks and his army stop, and it's just north of Jerusalem, and that's where on the day of the second coming, you know, Jesus tosses him into the lake of fire, him and the false prophet, and so that's all the further he gets on the day of return of Christ. But so it flows down, and I think the reason why we're given these specific cities, some of them which only existed in the Old Testament biblical times, is because it's very tightly being patterned by the Old Testament invasion of Assyria, King Sennacherib, when his forces came down and stopped at the city walls of Jerusalem, and actually the governor, was it the governor? One of the higher up subjects of Sennacherib was shouting at the Jewish people that were up on the wall, telling them to give up because their big army, 185,000, was going to destroy Jerusalem the same way that they had destroyed all the other towns. And he lists them in their towns that go all the way north up through Syria, like Damascus and the like, and coming all the way down through some area, of Israel, and all the way down here you see right up to the wall at Jerusalem. So he's saying give up. And so there's this strange thing that was starting to wear on me, which is a very, this is end time set of passages, but very tightly linked to the actual fulfillment that occurred with King Sennacherib in, we're probably talking in 721 BC, I think is the way that's dated. And so it just got me curious. And then I went 2 or 3 more days trying to figure out if I was going to give up on this. But it also bothered me that, we have this allusion here in 33. Behold, the Lord of hosts shall lop off the bough with terror, and the high ones of stature shall be hewn down, and the haughty shall be humbled. And a bunch of times I've gotten into Ezekiel 31 lately, where the tree metaphor was used for the Antichrist and for his faithful followers. And so boom, there again, it's we've got this weird thing of specifics that happen when the Assyrians came down to attack Jerusalem in 721. Actually, they took the northern kingdom in 721. I'm not sure when they got up to the wall of Jerusalem, but in the 700s BC, and specific cities as they came down to the wall. But then, you've got these end time allusions. And so I thought, okay, I got to get into it. It's Saturday. And so I started listening to a commentary. Chuck Smith is Calvary Chapel founder. Now there's 1,500 Calvary Chapel churches. And so it's just been an explosion. And what he was very much known for was line by line, verse by verse exposition. And if you want to listen to some of his stuff, he's got an audio series called C2000. Just look that up on the internet and you'll see, he goes right through the Old Testament, New Testament, just does commentary. And so I love doing that when I'm doing one of these studies because it gives you a lot of context. So I did that. I started back with a study that goes from Isaiah 6 through 10 because I was most curious about Isaiah 10. And what you get is in these 3 chapters, it's Isaiah warning the southern kingdom of Judah, which includes Jerusalem, that this northern army was going to invade and that they better get their act together. And so here in Isaiah 8, let's just do the outline. Isaiah 8, it starts there, and he's literally naming his children based on the prophecy. So he names this child Maroshala Hazbaz, and it means speed to the spoil. And so he's demonstrating here's how the northern army is going to come in, and then he uses this other allusion that the armies of Assyria will overflow like the river Euphrates overflows, and it'll overflow up until the neck of Judah. And so again, he's prophesying what's going to happen. And then there's this really curious couple of little statements that are tugged in there. Verse 8, Emmanuel is referenced, God with us, and he introduces Emmanuel, God with us, in Isaiah 7, verses 10 through 17, and then he says God is with us in verse 10. So he's introducing, Christ in this reflection about or prophecy about how Assyria was going to come into the land of Israel and destroy. And it goes right back and says talks from the Lord that the people will be broken, and he turned to the Lord and not uh, to man or to spirits. And so he's warning them, don't trust in alliances or whatever, and don't trust in mediums or spirits in your day of trouble. And then we get into chapter 9, and we get this real strong reference to the Christ. It's the one that says, and a son will be born. It's the Christmas passages, right? And you guys will recognize that, verses 1 through 8. And then verse 8 through, or verse 9 should be through 21, is a warning shot. Now this right in here is where you get Jonathan Cahn's Isaiah 9:10 prophecy about how the destruction, or the destruction of Israel came about, and that he sees the parallel happening with the U.S. And so first they get this warning shot where Syria, not Assyria, but Syria in this case, and the Philistines come against Samaria, but right on the heels of that, Assyria, which is northern Iraq, and we'll take a look at a map, the bigger problem comes in after and devours what happened here with Syria and the Philistines. And so they get the warning shot, and then the destruction moves in. And Jonathan Cahn makes a lot out of just a handful of verses there, and it's really cool stuff he's come up with. And I'll just put in my 2 cents here in the Isaiah 9, 10, and 11 verses. Again, it has this short little verse about the sycamore being cut down, and they'll plant a cedar in its place, or an Erez tree. And it points it back to Ezekiel 31 again, the Erez being the Antichrist. And the sycamore is actually a species of fig tree. So, God's people being cut down, and what's being put in its place is, Satan's people. And that's what happens, is the destruction overflows them. So that's real interesting how that symbology parallels the actual events on the ground. Then we get into Isaiah 10, and it's really kind of interesting now, because it's very hard to pick apart the original Assyrian invasion from the future prophetic part about it being the Antichrist. Starts in verse 1 through 4 saying, God says it's for punishments for not keeping the law and for mistreating of the needy. And then God sends Assyria against Israel, and this is when you read these verses in here, 5 through 11, it's very much seems like the Old Testament fulfillment part of, what was still prophecy here for Isaiah. And then you get in verses 12 through 19 that God strikes the Syrian invaders in one day, and we know that happened when they got to the wall. In Old Testament times, I'm saying, when Sennacherib's army got up to the wall of Jerusalem. If you remember, in one night, the angel of the Lord came and slaughtered 185,000 of the Assyrian troops, and they were just lying dead in the field the next morning when they got up. And actually, I think a couple of lepers out of Israel were the ones that discovered it. But again, you get this allusion to Christ. Now, this is what's really curious. There's a little story being built here. Now, in verse 16, there's a reference to the Lord of hosts. And verse 17, the light of Israel is mentioned, and the Holy One. And so you get all these names that, of course, we know are going to be used of Jesus. Especially you see this in the New Testament. And then you get verses 20 through 23, the returning remnant. Now, this is, if you think about it, the remnant didn't have to return until Judah and Jerusalem were actually sacked, not by Assyria, but by the Babylonian armies, which was 150 years later. So it's curious now we have the returning remnant here, if it was still following on the heels of the Old Testament time invasion of Assyria, but it's not. This is where we're definitely moving into the future end time, near far. It's the far version of the prophecy, if you ask me, is what we get starting here in 2023. And then the Assyrian is judged. Let's just go over to the pulpit commentary and see what it has to say about these verses in here now. Sorry. So they're specifically talking about verses 28 through 32, but it's the context that I'm curious about here. The graphic portraiture of the march of an Assyrian army on Jerusalem is probably not historic, but prophetic. Isaiah sees in a vision, Isaiah 1:1, and describes it like an eyewitness. There are at present no sufficient means of deciding what particular attack it refers, or indeed whether the march is one conducted by Sennacherib or Sargon. Sargon calls himself in one inscription the conqueror of the land of Judah, and the details of the present prophecy, especially verse 9, suit the reign of Sargon rather than that of his son. So they're trying to fit this, and what I think is interesting is he just got done saying that this is not historic but prophetic, and then they try and fit it into the exactly the historic, but we do know that they came down to the wall and they came from the north. And so when I showed you the this here, this fits how it occurred, but some of the other details they're saying don't line up exactly. And so but it's going to be the prophetic future fulfillment. And the commentaries that you'll get, like Chuck Smith, when he gets down to these verses, then is saying also that there's a end times fulfillment to these verses. So I thought that was very curious. Now, if you want to go read about the actual Old Testament fulfillment of um, the Assyrians coming down to the wall, and that it's in chapter 36 and 38 in Isaiah, and it's also in I want to say Chronicles or Second Kings. It's somewhere else as well, but if you find chapter 36 through 38, I'm sure you're going to see in the cross-reference text, if you have a study Bible, the other verses. And then the other thing that cements it is verse 27, that this is future fulfillment really when we get down to these verses, because in verse 27 it says, the yoke is removed because of the anointing oil. And the yoke is the oppression of, the Gentile forces from antiquity. And so to me, this really, and it said this too, I think I got this in commentary in my study Bible as well, that this is pointing toward the future fulfillment of when Israel is freed from Gentile oppression. And then, so we're just doing this little outline here. When you get to Isaiah 11, this whole chapter then is big time um, um, prophecy about the millennial reign, and it starts with Jesus will grow up out of a branch out of Jesse, and it goes all the way through here about how he's going to set up his millennial reign. And so that's why I think we've got this really curious transition chapter here, this near far prophecy. And what really struck me, and what I think the Lord was trying to poke my nose into, is how the end times Antichrist, the Assyrian, is going to mimic and follow after in very close order the events of the old invasion of Assyria. Um, that was meant for a model or for a pattern, which for those of you who have studied Bible prophecy, you know that many of the historical narratives set up patterns for future fulfillment. And I think this one is being shown to us because it's going to be a real tight pattern that gets followed by the Antichrist in the end times. And so as all that was dawning on me, I was thinking, what do I know about Assyria, or what's going on in current day if we're close to the end times, if this is the pattern we're being given. And this part is the spooky part, I guess. And don't don't overread what I'm going to say here, but I'm just giving you additional info. We just studied the biblical portion, so let's just say now we're going extra biblical. And so if this has nothing to do with nothing, I don't feel bad because I wanted to first represent the Bible, and now we're going to go look at the activities on the ground. But it struck me that this ISIS group or Islamic State, head up by this Al-Baghdadi guy, is, I hate to say it, but is setting up in the region of Assyria of old. And he's not only typing out the caliphate that was, foretold by, in the Islamic prophecies and texts, which, a lot of people say that was a Catholic Church generated religious system from when Muhammad was married to I guess it was a Catholic. I don't know if it was a nun or somebody a woman that was a staunch Catholic married Muhammad, and so there's a not really a conspiracy, but let's say more of a rumor that that's how the Islam started. So I'm going to drop that for now, but we've got this al-Baghdadi guy who the U.S. had held in one of our detention camps and then released him, and he said, well, I'll see you in New York. And he's got a PhD, I think, in psychology and a few others. He's well educated, and he's just absolutely ruthless, and everybody knows the stories of the beheadings and the child murdering and all the stuff he did. And so I was digging into that. Now let's take a look at where is the Islamic State currently. And you can see here it's roughly below the Tigris River, I think that is, and bordered mostly by the north by the Euphrates. I mean, I'm just giving gross generalities here. And where was ancient Assyria? Now this is a 850 BC map, but Assyria is sitting just north of the Euphrates River and just south of the Tigris River. And that, I was like, no way. I know this guy is trying to be the caliphate, but it's just, it's too much. That right now you could almost slap those maps over the top of each other and they'd be identical. And so I also looked at where this al-Baghdadi guy, where was he born? And he was born in Samarra, not Samaria, but Samarra. And you can see here, it's north of Baghdad a little ways. But this is just bothersome. So look at this, a city, Samarrati, I guess is how it's pronounced, founded by Sennacherib in 690 BC, according to a stele that was, in a museum in Baltimore. Fortified Assyrian site, Assyrian at El whatever, on Tigris opposite Samarra. So here's this dude coming out of a town that was founded by Sennacherib. And so when I said the pattern, the pattern of these verses really fits closely to that invasion of Sennacherib's army, because then they're put down by the angel of the Lord. Well, think about what happens in the end time. The Antichrist marches his armies up through the valley of Megiddo, up to, we just read Nob, just north of the wall in Jerusalem, and then Christ returns, who in the Old Testament often was referred to as the angel of the Lord. Get it? And boom, we know what happens. The eyes melt out of their sockets, and the blood's up to the bridles of the horses with the second coming and what's called the War of Armageddon. So it's blowing me away, and I'm not necessarily saying Baghdadi here is the Antichrist. I'm just saying, as I looked in all these parallels in Isaiah 10 and understanding that the Assyrian is the Antichrist in the Old Testament, and I see how that's fit together, and they skip over the actual capture of Jerusalem here in chapter 10 that happened with um, the Babylonians, the Neo-Babylonians, but it's talking about the Assyrians coming up to the wall of Jerusalem and then getting slaughtered, the Sennacherib um, invasion of the land, and knowing that in the end times, Jesus, who was called the angel of the Lord, defeats the armies of the Antichrist in the exact same area. And now you get, this, I just hate thinking about this Baghdadi guy being born in the area of Assyria, conquering a land that is the ancient Assyria, and being born in the city that was founded by Sennacherib. So I just thought I'd share that. I'm not trying to make too much of the latter half of this, but I just wanted to show you what's in the Bible and as it refers to the end time events as best as I could. And then we'll say this other stuff here is extra biblical, but I put in the bucket of troubling. So um, and let's just, speculate out loud, if that is what we're seeing here, we know from, let's say, a proper interpretation of 2 Thessalonians 2 that the church is gone before the Antichrist is revealed. And so I can't say that that's what we're looking at here. It, it seems very contrived in the way this is going on, but I think about it, how is this even possible? How does this guy out of nowhere who is in our jail all of a sudden potentially become this Antichrist figure? And there actually is a sort of a logical flow. We know as he's been conquering here, the NATO forces haven't been trying to stop him. We sent in 300 advisors who haven't done nothing. And yet it's the most brutal murdering. I mean, it's at least as bad as the method of murdering that was going on during the Holocaust. And some say even more gruesome based on how some of these killing of children have occurred. And so you have the absolute depravity, the deepest depravity being demonstrated. And then you think about this, what is likely to happen in the Bible? Let's say you have a Psalm 83 war and the local Arab populations around Israel get seriously defeated. And we see that in the second half of Obadiah and in Zephaniah 2 and in Psalm 83 and whatever. And then we see the broader ring, the war of Gog Magog in Ezekiel 38 and 39, taking out Russia, Iran, Turkey, whatever. Well, think of where this guy is. He's just to the west side of the likely invasion of the Gog Magog war, and we know that the whole land of Gog Magog gets judged by God. So it's not just the armies which are decimated, it's the whole land is judged. So what kind of a vacuum is opened up for a guy like this after all the local armies around Israel are defeated? Now, Israel will probably fill into those areas according to Bill Salas, but then all the warriors in all the countries, Turkey, Iran, Russia, that were part of the Gog Magog are defeated. Does this guy go on a rampage? I'm just talking about a scenario, and start taking over huge swaths of Eastern Europe and the Middle East. And now, many people, including myself, don't see America in Bible prophecy. And this guy's last words when he was released from jail to be sent home was, "We'll see you in New York." So if America is judged by God, and we know in the Bible here, the Assyrian is the axe of the Lord, is wielded by the Lord. Could something like this be America gets judged, these characters invade, and then you've got the War of Gog Magog, and they just expand from where they currently are in this region of Iraq and take over much of Eastern Europe and the Middle East, all the way up through Russia. So I'm just going to throw that out there. How could you get a world ruler out of a guy that was in jail just a few years ago? It's actually plausible. So I'll leave you with that, and God bless everybody. Uh, it's got to be close. I mean, whether it's this scenario or another one, it's got to be close. And I just thought the Lord had this one pressed on my mind. I had to do my video, and I feel like I learned a lot. So thanks, Saints. We'll see you upstairs soon, huh?